Hi, my name's Hannah, and today I want to talk about my experience attending Professor Rod Adams' lecture on evaluative logic. This lecture was put on October 14th from 5 to 6:30 in Eddy room 200. And the purpose of this lecture was to prove that there are evaluative answers and a proposed framework to find those answers. So let's just get right into it. I want to start off by talking about my experience at this lecture. So I arrived at this lecture pretty early and I stayed from 5 to 6:30. The first hour of this lecture was Professor Adams lecturing and talking about evaluative logic and giving examples of how it can be used. And then the next 30 minutes was him answering questions from students and other professors that were there. So I arrived to this lecture pretty early, as I already said, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. I was kind of just expecting a lot of philosophy students, which there were. There was a lot of students and a lot of sweaters, but there were also professors there. There was mixed ages and men and women at this lecture. This lecture started off with a man introducing Professor Adams, and then Professor Adams getting up and he started talking. He opened his lecture with Super Bowl 59, and he wanted to evaluate whether the Chiefs were better than the Eagles. And he did this using a very specific kind of framework. I'll put a little picture, here, let me move over. I'll put a little picture of his slideshow, which I'll be using throughout this video, will be cited in the description. So this framework that he's talking about and using to evaluate whether the Chiefs were better than the Eagles is evaluative logic, and it's what this lecture was about. After the Super Bowl example, he gave another example of the luminiferous ether. And if you're like me and had no idea what this was, it was a widely accepted theory that there was a universal substance believed to act as the medium for transmission. And that quote was taken off Britannica website, which is also cited in the description. And everything that I talk about will be cited in this description. And this idea was disproven, but I think it's still cool. And the reason he used this example was to show that if a theory isn't true, there needs to be a new theory that comes after it. Evaluative logic is a framework that we can use to evaluate whether a statement is true and logical. And it goes like this. We have a statement. This is our A. And this statement can only be true if the criteria, which are listed under it as numbers, are also true. This evaluation of a statement might seem simple, but there's a lot more that went behind it, and it's really interesting to hear how Professor Adams came up with this idea, which I'll get into next. So the founding principles of evaluative logic are the instrumental principle, the laws of thought, and the collaborative principle. I'll go over these pretty briefly and give the definition that Professor Adams gave us on his slides. So starting off with the first one, the instrumental principle. And this says that for any goal, the goal holder self-obligates to identify and implement means. This basically means that if you have a goal, you're the one that needs to implement means to achieve that goal. Then there is the laws of thought. And these say that each thing is identical to itself, each contradiction is false, and each thing is either itself or not itself, and it can't be both. The hardest one for me to understand was that last one, and so I'm going to give a pretty basic example. So this example is that a ball can be blue or it can be not blue, but it can't be both. Finally, we have the collaborative principle, which says that for any genuine question, there's a correct answer, which can be achieved by collaboration given sufficient time. I think that this one is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't get too much into that one. This framework of evaluating something objectively can be used in self-governance, and it's a great way to objectively evaluate anything, which was the purpose of this lecture. Professor Adams also explained that a lot of youth feel hopeless, and he believes that it's because everyone believes that there is no correct answer. And so evaluative logic can be a way to come to these correct answers and possibly reduce the level of anxiety in youth. He also says that the goal of evaluative logic was not always to agree, but to learn with and from each other. After hearing this lecture, I was left with a lot of questions. I've never had any experience with philosophy jargon, so it was a little difficult for me to keep up. I decided to reach out and email Professor Adams, and we ended up having a very nice conversation about not only evaluative logic and how to understand it, but also how we can implement this into business practices. In our conversation, we talked about big business practices and how we can implement this to identify problems and then solve them as strategically. But I'm gonna focus and kind of narrow it down into how we can use evaluative logic in leadership. I connected this evaluative logic framework to the rational decision-making model, right here. And this model says that to make a rational decision, you need to go through steps like identifying a problem, establishing criteria, weighing the criteria, and so on and so forth. But when you're going through these steps, you can use evaluative logic. I'm going to use a pretend situation to demonstrate how these steps can coincide with evaluative logic. So let's say that we have a member of a team leaving. Now we need to decide what to do about it. Should we leave their spot vacant or hire someone new? We can use evaluative logic to get through this step. So we start off with this. We should fill this position if 1, it would make the team more productive, and 2, it will benefit the team. Then we need to determine if this criteria is true. So let's say we leave this position vacant for a while, and the team gets less sales, so it's less productive, and the morale is low because they have to pick up all of this extra work. This means that we need to hire someone new. And this fills the first step in the rational decision-making process by identifying the problem. Now, we've worked through this first step with evaluative logic, and we've also kind of worked our way into the second steps, which is to establish the decision criteria, so making the team more productive and boosting morale, and then weighing the options, which we did. Next, we need to generate alternatives. So we could have an AI fill this role, or we could maybe give up some of these tasks to other teams or other employees. Now, we can evaluate these alternatives using evaluative logic, of course. Our big question is, should we hire someone, use AI, or divide up tasks? And let's go back to our criteria. We need to boost productivity and morale. Will using an AI do this? We would need to implement it and then run a test run a test against these criteria. And same with giving tasks to other employees. For time's sake, I'm just going to say that we do all of that, and nobody knows how to use the AI, and when we give up tasks, things get lost and nobody knows what's going on. So now we've evaluated our alternatives, and all that's left to do is select the best choice. Using evaluative logic, we can say that when we tried to implement an AI, productivity dropped. So we don't want to do that. Then we divided up tasks and data got lost. So that option isn't logical to go with. Therefore, we should hire somebody new. And when we are putting out our job application, it might be a good idea to use evaluative logic to decide what experience we want and who to hire. The idea of objective evaluation can be used for all kinds of decision making. It gets rid of bias because you must weigh your options against objective criterion, and then that leads to a fair statement. This framework can be very helpful in business decisions, as I showed in my example in connection to the rational decision-making model. Lastly, I want to give a big thanks to Professor Rod Adams for sitting down with me and really helping me understand this idea of evaluative logic.